And we'll hand it over to Anna and myself, and Sarah will go on mute.
Great, thank you. So my name is Anna Truxas. I'm the interim executive director at the Portland Chinatown Museum. I'd like to welcome back everyone to Hidden Histories, a series developed and created by our founding director, Jacqueline Peterson Loomis. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. The Portland Chinatown Museum acknowledges and honors the Indigenous peoples and their descendants of the Lower Columbia and Willamette River regions, whose lands the city of Portland and our museum currently occupy. These include Willamette, Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Motlala Chinook tribes, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, who today are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and the many other Chinookan peoples who established communities along the Lower Columbia, whose descendants are today members of the Grand Ronde, Warm Springs, and Siletz Confederated Tribes of Oregon. Today's session will be moderated by Museum Board Member Tracy Kwan. Tracy.
Hi, good morning, everybody. About this program, we are doing a Hidden Histories, Oregon's Early Chinatowns and Chinese Worker Settlements series. This is the 7th in that series. And this was organized by and moderated by the Portland Chinatown Museum in partnership with museums, state parks and forests, city governments, and other educational institutional organizations across Oregon. Hidden Histories aims to provide a better understanding of Chinese immigrant history and culture and its importance to Oregon's growing Asian American population. We do so by sharing stories, archives, material culture, and histories of Oregon's early rural and urban Chinese communities. We want to acknowledge that Hidden Histories was made possible in part by a grant from the Oregon Humanities, a statewide nonprofit organization, and an independent affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. This funds Oregon's Humanities Grants Program. And for 50 years, Oregon Humanities has offered programs and publications that help Oregonians connect, reflect, and learn from one another. About today's program specifically, we are joined by archaeologists Jacqueline Cheung and Eric Gleason, who will be presenting the Dalles Chinatown, Remembering a Community. This presentation explores the early development of the Dalles, the formation of Chinatown using maps, newspaper articles, and photographs, supplemented by archival documents from the National Archives. This historical documentation provides some details about everyday life in Chinatown and the Dalles, and the merchants and their families that made a home there. Time permitting, we will also have a short Q&A that will conclude the program. And to start us off, we have our museum staff member, Kapiolani, who will introduce our guest today, and I'll spotlight her here.
Hi, welcome everyone. Just a little bit about our speakers today. Jacqueline Cheung is an archaeologist who works in the Pacific Northwest, participating in projects for the Colville Confederated Tribes, National Park Service, and private contractors. She has worked on a wide variety of both historic and prehistoric sites, and in recent years, she has worked with the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project on excavations at the Kamwa Cheung Historic Site and Chinese mining camp in the Malheur National Forest. Eric Gleason spent his formative years in Oregon, growing up in Boring and attending Sam Barlow High School in Gresham, Oregon. He furthered his education at Washington State University, receiving a degree in anthropology in 1982. He has been pursuing the life of a field archaeologist ever since, beginning with work at North Bonneville, Washington in 1978, and most recently on the Upper Columbia River on Lake Roosevelt, working for the Colville Confederated Tribes. He and Jacqueline Cheung moved to the Dalles in 1989, where they bought an old fixer-upper house. As if one large unfinished project was not enough, he bought a long vacant building in downtown the Dalles 2 decades ago, and has been slowly trying to fix that up as well. During the course of the restoration of the historic Wing Hong Hai Company Store building, his passion for archaeology and historic preservation merged with the discovery of the Chinatown archaeological site. This ongoing project is helping to uncover the history and significance of Chinatown in the Dalles and place it in a regional and national perspective. Welcome, Jacqueline and Eric.
Thank you. I guess we'll begin the program now. This first slide kind of shows a few things. It shows the front facade of the building as it looks now. So it was built in 1879, and through the years served many purposes beyond just being a Chinese store and a Chinese laundry. Its last use was as storage, and then it was kind of abandoned in the 1960s or 1970s, and sat pretty much largely vacant until we purchased it. And then we've been kind of slowly working on the restoration as well. And that restoration turned into an archaeological project as well, when in 2008, there was a little bit of a looting incident that went on in back of the building. Somebody dug a hole and uncovered some Chinese ceramics and gaming pieces. So as part of kind of investigating that, we decided we needed to record it as an archaeological site. So we, after doing a little investigation, we really realized that entire half of the block was part of the archaeological site, and that most of it was just covered by fill and asphalt. And so we ended up recording that whole half of the block as the Dalles Chinatown archaeological site. So you'll also see on this slide, there's a picture of a Chinese family that lived next door to this building. And then also the advertising sign for the Chuki and Company store, which was located 2 doors to the east. So the Dalles, Oregon is located on the Columbia River, about 80 miles east of Portland. And it's always been a transportation hub and a hub for goods and services. Starting back into well before settlement. So it's located on the traditional lands of the Tenino, Wasco, and Wishram, and the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and also the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs. So it's just, the town is located just at the foot of what was the Long Narrows and 5 Mile Rapids and Celilo Falls. So a long cataract on the Columbia River that hindered navigation. So steamboats would generally travel from the mouth of the river up to Portland, and then the second section would be from Portland up to the Dalles. And at the Dalles, you'd have to disembark because the rapids were not navigable. So that all kind of formed part of the reason that there was a town here. And it also served as kind of a transportation hub into the gold mines at Canyon City and also other parts of the Northwest. So when we started doing the background research on just the history of the building and the archaeology as well, we started by looking at all the historic documents that we could find. So we looked at historic pictures. This is a picture looking north down Washington Street in the Dalles during the 1894 flood. You can see a building up on the shoreline on the Washington side of the river there. When we looked at census records as far back as we could go, the earliest census records for the Dalles are 1860, and that census shows 2 Chinese folks living here in the Dalles. So from the very beginning of the historic period in the Dalles, there have been Chinese here. We looked at maps. This is a 1940s map that the Corps of Engineers drew of the area prior to doing some work on a retaining wall. We looked at business directories. So this business directory lists the 2 businesses that were going on in the store around 1910. And we looked at newspaper archives, which have become more accessible of late. So that's really been good for us. Here's a story about a fire that burned in one of the buildings, the Chinese buildings downtown. And then here's another newspaper story where the chief of police kind of declares a article that had appeared in the Oregonian as about tunnels and stuff in the Dalles as being mostly unfounded. So here's the earliest photograph of the Dalles that we have. It's an 1867 photograph taken by Carlton Watkins. And you can see the Mount Hood in the background and the mouth of Mill Creek here with sandbars on both sides, and the Catholic church kind of right there in the center of town. And then this is mostly the commercial area of town here. So you can see it was a pretty small, compact town at that point. The Portage Railroad had just been built around Celilo Falls, so that's what this trestle going across the creek is. And here's a later picture showing the downtown commercial district in, I think, about the mid-1870s. This is right after another of the big floods. It seemed like we got floods in the town pretty much every year or every other year of varying degrees. So you can see this was a pretty major one. It got up to about that level on these houses and kind of really disrupted the boardwalk sidewalks and the Portage Railroad tracks here. This building is the only one in the photo that's still standing. It's the Waldron Brothers drugstore, and it's pretty much directly across from Chinatown. So the area where the Wing Hung High store is burned, almost everything burned completely to the ground in 1879 in a fire that started in one of the nearby hotels in the Lantern Room. So the red highlight shows the area that burned, and then the blue rectangles are buildings that survived that fire. And interestingly enough, the 3 buildings that survived that fire are still standing. This is the Baldwin Saloon here, which is still the Baldwin Saloon, so that's great. This was Governor Z.F. Moody's dry goods store, and then this is the Waldron Brothers drugstore that you could see in that earlier photograph. So shortly after all of these buildings burned, there was a big lot of rebuilding going on. So within 6 months of that fire burning down that block, most of the block had been rebuilt. And part of the reason was because that Portage Railroad was being connected up to the Transcontinental. So this is an 1883 ceremony kind of celebrating the opening of that line, which connected Portland to markets to the east and ran right through the middle of Main Street in the Dalles. And while they were doing this, because there was persistent flooding problems in the Dalles, they raised up the grade of the town. So I have a couple of slides that'll kind of detail that. But this is an 1884 lithograph that shows just how much the town had grown since its founding in the 1850s. You can once again see Mill Creek. This is the Transcontinental Railroad coming to join the Portage Railroad and go right down Main Street. Steamboats plying the river and Mount Hood in the distance. So this is a detail of that same lithograph showing what the area that would become the central part of Chinatown. So this is the Wing Hung High Company store right here. It was surrounded on both sides by Chinese stores as well. This is C.F. Moody's dry goods store here, and the Waldron Brothers dry goods store here, and a hotel, a big hotel called the Cosmopolitan. Now, most of these hotels that kind of were centered along Main Street had associated Chinese laundries as well. And you can see by this time, 1884, the grade had been raised. So all of the wood frame buildings had been kind of jacked up and supported on piers. The brick buildings had their entrances raised to meet the new grade. And you can see even on 2nd Street, the sidewalks are up on posts as well. So we used Sanborn fire insurance maps to kind of trace the history of the building through town. These are great historical resources. So the building here is circled. This is the earliest one that we have, which is from 1884. At that point, it was being used as a dwelling. Shortly after being rebuilt in late 1879, early 1880, the tenants that had been there when it burned down moved back in. So a shoe store was operating there, as well as a jewelry and watch repair business. And you can see right next door, there's a Chinese wash house in 1894, the big flood comes. Even raising the street grade up 12 feet didn't protect you from this flood. And this is the only historic photograph that we have that really shows the Chinatown area. Actually, some versions of this photo say right across the bottom, Chinatown, the Dalles, 1894. This is the Wing Hung High Company store here. The Chu Key store was here, and the Doc Sing store is right at this location. And this shows kind of the building as it sits now. So all the buildings around it have been torn down, mostly some burned, but mostly torn down in the 40s, 50s, and 60s as part of urban renewal projects. And it had been converted into a parking lot. And you can see how the back of the store here now has a ramp going down into it. It had been converted to a creamery in the 1940s. So they enlarged this door in the back for access into the basement. And I had assumed that when they did all of this cutting here that they had removed most of the archaeological deposits, but I was pretty much wrong about that. So some of the records that we've found that have been really helpful deal with the Chinese exclusion period. So that period from 1882 till 1943, when laws really restricted the immigration and the movement of Chinese in the US. So one of the things that all of these laws do, as opposed to more than just restricting people's movements, is they really document the community. So from these records, it turns out that we know a lot about the Chinese in the Dalles, more than we thought we would. And also, that really changes how the settlement pattern and the uses that and occupations of the Chinese that were here in the Dalles, because the Exclusion Act really kind of divided the Chinese into two different classes. The first class was the privileged class, and they included travelers and scholars and merchants. And then a second class, which was laborers. And the exclusion didn't really want to limit the first class so much but it wanted to really exclude the second class. It was not welcoming at all to laborers coming into the US. So that made Chinese that were already in the US at that time inclined to develop merchant status so that they could have some of those privileges of the privileged class, which would include bringing their family over from China and also traveling more freely back and forth to China. So we also looked at census records. So here's the census records for the Dalles, and you can see starting in 1862, we have two folks, and then it really rises steeply up until the 1880s. And then after exclusion, it just kind of dwindles down as the population ages, people move into Portland, and the community becomes a little less vital. Also in 1880, you had a lot of railroad workers in town for that whole construction of the railroad grade. So we use these maps to kind of, the Sanborn maps, to kind of trace the kind of different businesses and where they were located in town. So in 1884, most of the businesses were Chinese laundries, with a few other Chinese dwellings or buildings that were just listed as Chinese. 1889, it's still mostly laundries or unknown buildings, which were probably mostly lodging buildings at that point. And then by 1892, you see that we start to get a lot of merchandise stores, which are the ones in black. And they're really kind of coming into vogue. Ooh. And then by 1909, you can see that almost a good half of the businesses are now merchandise stores. Others are dwellings or restaurants. Restaurants are kind of a popular also option for the Chinese. One thing to note also on this 1909 map is for the first time you have a Chinese laundry located here on 2nd Street, just right next to where City Hall is. And it's kind of an interesting aside, right in 1909, the City Council of the Dalles adopted an ordinance which restricted Chinese laundries by taxation. So if you had a Chinese laundry that was north of the alley between 1st and 2nd Street, you paid $3 a quarter for a business tax. And if you had one that was south of that alley, you paid $100 a quarter for a business tax. So it's a little, I don't really know whether that laundry there locating itself next to City Hall kind of prompted that ordinance or it was a reaction to that ordinance. And by 1926, you see that we have a lot of Chinese dwellings, unknown Chinese buildings, which are probably also dwellings, and then the last two of the Chinese merchant stores. And by 1942, the last of the Chinese merchant stores are still in business. That would be the Chukey and Company store. And this shows just an example of the kind of Exclusion Act records that we accessed up in Seattle with the help of the volunteers and staff up at the National Archives there. These things are really kind of informative. Before we accessed these records, there were maybe a handful of pictures of Chinese residents of the Dalles that we had access to. After these, we had dozens of pictures. So we could really start to connect names and faces together, and also the businesses and how the businesses function. So I'll turn things over to Jackie.
So the stories behind each of these Chinese merchandise stores kind of reveal the strategies and the difficulties and the efforts of the individuals who ran them, and also illustrate how they interacted with their fellow countrymen and also with other people in the community. Even though they were partners invested in a merchandise business, many also had to do a variety of jobs to make a living. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of these families and their businesses using information from the Chinese Exclusion Act documents, local newspapers, and other sources. And we also recognize that these stories are mostly seen through the lens of immigration interrogations and also non-Chinese newspaper accounts, and that we have few firsthand accounts. So from 1894 to 1913, Li Yunhong and his partners were the proprietors of the Wing Hong Hai Company Chinese mercantile store located at 210 East First Street. Li Yunhong came to the US in 1882 at the age of 17 from Sangan Village, Sunning District, now Taishan County, Guangdong. And a year later, in 1883, he moved to the Dalles. He worked for a time as a cook and janitor for the French family, who were prominent local bankers, and he would eventually entrust all his savings and banking transactions to them, and also relied on them to vouch for him as witnesses. The Wing Hong Hai Company store and the Yun Hai Laundry started as a partnership with his older brother, Li Yun But. And by 1901, Li Yun Hong was also the proprietor of the New York restaurant on 2nd Street. Over the years, other Li brothers and cousins and relatives joined the company, including Li Wing, Li Dick, Li Yip Tai, Li Song, Li On, Li Chu, and Li Hing. Typically, one or more partners managed the store while other partners visited China or pursued other types of work. As the partners changed, Li Yunhong remained as the manager. The 1900 census lists 9 residents living at the building. Li Yunhong as the merchant, partner Li Dick was a student, and partner Li Wing was a laborer, and other residents included other laborers and 2 cooks. So although it was profitable, the associated laundry business created problems for the Wing Hong Hai partners who wanted to be bona fide merchants under the restrictions of the Exclusion Act. Li Yunhong initially operated the Wing Hong Hai store and Yun Hong Hai Laundry in the same building. And you can kind of see that the storefront is divided there. The 1900 Sanborn insurance map indicates the building was divided in half, with the laundry on one side, the store on the other, and a wash house and drying platform located out back. By 1906, the partners had invested heavily in the laundry, and immigration inspectors noticed. They said, while the stock of merchandise on hand in the store is quite small, the laundry is a large and well-equipped one. At this time, Li Yunhong asked if he could bring his wife and son from China, and the answer was no, because the laundry business made him a laborer. But although the laundry business compromised Li Yunhong's merchant status, the laundry equipment in his store, along with the profits, counted towards his assets as a laborer, which qualified him for a laborer's return certificate, which meant he could travel and return. When Li Yunhong returned to the Dalles in 1908, he began to perfect his merchant status and began to separate himself from the laundry business. He moved the laundry operation next door and sold it to Li Binghua. And then he removed the dividing wall between the laundry and the store and expanded the store across the front. The connecting doorway remained between the two adjacent buildings. And there were 3 laundrymen living at the Winghong High store, but now the two businesses were carefully delineated. So you can see in this, that there, you can see this dividing store, and you can also see this connection to the back, which still had part of the laundry. And then there's the brick dinner remnant of that connecting door. In 1911, when Li Yunhong made his last application to travel in hopes of returning with his family, the laundry had a completely separate entrance. However, both Li Yunhong and his partner and brother Li Wing were denied merchant return certificates in 1911. The Immigration Service investigated Li Yunhong and the partners prior to their travel request. They found gambling tables behind the store, and they also discovered that Li Yunhong had been arrested in San Bernardino, California that January, where he supposedly went to recuperate from an illness. He was caught piloting 3 contraband Chinese and had some old identification papers and a business card of a Chinese man in Tijuana. He was released, but the suspicions of him smuggling immigrants across the border remained on his record. In contrast, the residents of the Dalles regarded him as a likable, successful businessman. So when he died in an automobile accident in 1912, at the age of 45, the Dalles Chronicle had the headline, "Popular Local Chinaman Killed," and described his pleasing personality and noted that he could read and write English and had accumulated a considerable amount of money through his excellent business ability. The Dalles band led his funeral procession to the cemetery while incense burned outside his door in Chinatown. Instead of burial, he was embalmed and his remains were shipped to his family in China. So he didn't leave a will, but his probate records show that he had over $2,000 in cash and about $270 worth of goods in stock. Some of those goods include furniture, chinaware, Chinese groceries, tea, rice, oil, preserved vegetables, Japanese oysters, canned goods, liniments, sauces, whiskey, wine, cigarettes and cigars, firecrackers, candles, aprons, and Chinese shirts and shoes. Li Yunhong's family was living in Huoyan, Taishan district. He was survived by his wife, Su Shi, his son, Toi Duk, daughter, Ku Shi, and a 4-year-old daughter. His widow decided to keep his quarter interest in the store so that their son could come to the US and run the store when he got older. But this did not happen since the business did not last long after the death of Li Yunhong. So these are the remains of the Chuki Company store that are still there at 214 East 1st Street. And you can see that the cast iron columns of the storefront are still intact there. The Chuki Company store located was in business from about 1889 until 1942. It was both the longest running Chinese business in the Dalles and the last remaining one in Chinatown. In the beginning, brothers Wang Ling and Wang Cheung ran the business. Wang Cheung was probably the first to be known as Chuki, reportedly arriving in the Dalles as early as 1869. He is likely the Chuki who was a cook at the Umatilla House Hotel who reportedly could keep 200 orders in his head and never mix them up. He is said to have lent money to the hotel owners to rebuild after the 1879 fire. His brother Wong Ling joined him at the store in 1891 and eventually took over the business. The Chuki Company store sold a variety of goods, including groceries, clothing, and teas, with some of the stock bought from local hardware and grocery stores. Perhaps some of their Chinese customers felt more comfortable buying these goods from a Chinese store, and they could probably also buy on credit. Rooms behind the store were used as living quarters, some occupied by Wong Ling and his family, and others by lodgers. But Wong Ling denied collecting any rent for the lodgings, claiming he let friends stay in the rooms. Wong Ling returned to China several times, leaving his brother, partners, or neighboring store owners to manage the store in his absence. He was in China from 1906 to 1910, managing his house and rice fields in his home village of Jingboi in the Sunwoi district. During this visit, his wife died, he remarried and fathered another son. When he returned to the Dalles, he sent money to China to support his family. By 1915, because of his good standing as a merchant, Wong Ling was able to bring his wife, Chun Shi, and his young son, Guan Jing, to the Dalles. Wong Ling lived at his store on First Street until his death in 1942. His son, his widow, who was by then known as Mary Wong, and the few other local Chinese remaining in the city attended the funeral. And he is buried in the Oddfellow Cemetery here in the Dalles. Wong Ling's son, Guan Jing, attended public schools in the Dalles, starting at the Court Street School. Here he is. He went and then graduated from the Dalles High School in 1932. In school, he went by the name Jing Wong and used this name even after he became a US citizen and chose Gilbert as his American name. During World War II, he served in the US Army Air Force. He married and raised a family in Portland, and he worked as a cook in several Portland restaurants. So here's a picture of the doxing company and the partners and their families. And this photo is the only image that we have of that shows the front of the store, even though this is a photo from the 50s or 60s when it was an automotive machine shop. The doxing company operated from 1893 until 1917 at 216 Main Street, and then reorganized as the Cheung Wo Company, which operated in the same building until 1929. The business partners were members of the Li family and others from Sa Lan village in Taishan. Over the years, there were 3 to 5 partners, each investing $1,000. The business sold merchandise, did labor contracting, sold drugs, and also served as a bank. In 1901, they reported total assets of $10,000. And in 1913, reported the business made an annual profit of $3,000. In 1907, Li Jack told immigration inspectors that the gambling tables in the back room were once managed by another man, but no longer used. As the partners established their business and their merchant status, they brought their families from China. Over the years, only one family at a time lived at the business. Partner Li Ho helped establish the business and was locally known as Doc Sing, after the name of his store. In 1888, a newspaper article mentioned that he got married in the Dalles before a judge. He married a Chinese woman named Hen Li from Walla Walla. When his wife died in 1900, her funeral was described in the paper. Their young son, Li Chu, continued to live at the store with his father. Li Ho also had a wife and son in China, and in 1902, he brought wife Toi Si and son Li Poi to the Dalles, and they lived in the store for 6 years. Folks in the Dalles knew both his boys, but they did not see his wife often enough to recognize her. But at that time, she was the only merchant wife on First Street. In 1908, Li Ho and his family returned to China. Before he left, he made sure he had witness statements and documents showing he was a merchant in good standing so his sons could return to help with the business. Li Ho told immigration officers, "My boys will go to school in China and may not return for several years. My wife will never come back, and I don't know whether I will ever come back." Li Ho died a few years later in 1910, but his sons, Li Poi and Li Chu, returned in 1911, and Li Poi eventually became a partner in the business. Li Sam was another partner who brought his family to the Dalles. He was also from Salon Village and was related to Li Ho. He managed the store when the other partners were away. His wife, Chan Shi, and son, Phuc Du, came to join him in 1910. His daughter, Jun Ku, was born at the Dak Sing store building in December of that year. She was also given an American name, Rose Lee. 3 years later, Li Sam and his wife and daughter moved to Hong Kong. Li Sam died a few years later, and his wife died 4 years after that. 8-year-old Jun Ku was raised in Hong Kong by her godmother. But before she died, her mother made sure she knew where she was born. She understood the value of her immigration form 430, which is the application of alleged American-born Chinese for pre-investigation of status. She said, "My mother gave it to me before her death, and it has been in my possession all this time." So Jun Ku married and returned to the US in 1935 at the age of 24. Immigration officers questioned her about her birthplace and closely compared the baby picture on her form against her adult appearance. She said she planned to settle in Indiana with her husband and her father-in-law. People in the Dalles knew Li Jack as the mayor of Chinatown. He claimed he was a partner in the company as early as 1898, but in the 1900 census, he was listed as a lodger and a laborer. He was an active partner and store manager from about 1907 to 1929. He first came to the US about 1877, but returned to China several times, sometimes staying there for several years to get married, father children, and conduct other business. Under Li Jack's management, the business expanded. In 1913, he purchased the lease of the nearby Hotel Washington and offered rooms for rent. He may not have kept that business very long. In 1917, the business reorganized as the Kong Chong Wo Company. This new company shifted focus and it stocked items that appealed to a wider audience. Immigration inspectors who visited in 1920 described it as a bona fide establishment and has a very attractive stock of goods on hand. According to the store business card, it sold silks, dressing gowns, kimonos, dishes, and embroidered goods, as well as all kinds of fireworks at wholesale prices. A freight company did regular business with the store, delivering and hauling goods, and the police chief, Frank Heaters, sometimes stopped in to buy tea. In the 1920s, Li Jack's son, Li Shifan, said the store did business mostly with white people and only a few Chinese. By then, about 44 Chinese were listed in the census. In 1919, the Sunday Oregonian reported that Li Jack of the Dalles, the local Chinatown mayor, had come to Portland to purchase a dragon and other items to decorate floats for the Chinese section of the parade for the Wasco County Fair. Although the Kong Chong Wo store catered to white customers, it was also a gathering place for the Chinese community. In 1920, when a shooting occurred as a result of mistaken identities and fears of a rival Tong, the injured man was brought to the store, and community members gathered there for safety and news. And the Chinese met the police and the mayor there for questioning. The newspaper stated that the store is regarded as the headquarters in this Chinese district. In 1907 and 1909, Li Jack brought his teenage sons, Li Shifan and Li Shiwoi, to the US. Li Shifan attended school in the Dalles and Portland and worked as a cook and waiter in different places before returning to the Dalles to manage the Kongchang-Lo store. In 1920, Li Jack's wife and the mother of his sons died. The following year, Li Shifan managed the store while Li Jack returned to China and remarried. Li Jack's second wife, Ho Lin, arrived in 1921 and their son was born in the Dalles. In 1929, Li Jack moved his family and the Kongchang-Lo store to Portland, locating on Northwest 4th Avenue. And by this time, only the Chukki store remained in the Dalles. The year before he moved, the Dalles Chronicle featured a story reminiscing about the heyday of Chinatown. Li Jack was described as one of the few lone Chinamen, a pioneer resident. In 1936, at the age of 78, Li Jack sold his business and traveled back to China with his wife and youngest son. The Wing Yun Company was in business from 1909 to 1918 at 208 First Street, run by members of the Sit family from Cheung Village in Sunway District. The Wing Yun Company sold Chinese merchandise and did labor contracting. In 1915, the company consisted of 5 partners, each investing between $450 and $500. 3 of the partners were active in the day-to-day operations, and the other 3 were silent partners who did not live in the Dalles. Sijek was the buyer and salesman for the company. He had a wife in China and an adopted son, Sir Lem. That's him. A few months after his first wife in China died, his cousin, Sit Dai, a fruit rancher and also a labor contractor for the super cannery in the Dalles, arranged for him to marry a widow, Feng Shi. They were married by proxy when Feng Shi moved into his house in China to help care for his adopted son. A year later, Sijek returned to China to be with his second wife and bring his adopted 8-year-old son to the Dalles. When Sijek and adopted son Shirlun arrived in Portland, they were closely questioned. Other members of the Sit family living in Portland and with ties to the Cheung village provided statements describing the family situation, marriages, and his son. Cousin Sit Dai made a very favorable impression on the immigration inspector. The inspector closely observed the interactions of the father and the son and saw that they had a genuine relationship. So Shirlun came to live in the Wing Yun store and attended school in the Dalles. In 1915, Sijek applied to bring his wife Feng Shi and 3-year-old daughter Kui Fun to the Dalles. This was the same year that Wang Ling of the Chukki store also brought his family. 2 sons and another daughter were later born to Sijek and Feng Shi in the Dalles. He died in 1921 and his family remained in town for another 5 years. In 1926, Feng Shi and her young children traveled back to China. The children obtained the paperwork necessary to return, but Feng Shi did not intend to ever come back. So from 1900 to 1910, there were 11 different restaurants with Chinese cooks or proprietors. The Baldwin Saloon, New York restaurant, and California restaurant were run by the Chinese. Wang Sen, who ran the California restaurant hired Chinese cooks, but employed white waiters and cashiers to serve his predominantly white customers. Chinese food was offered at other restaurants, such as the Yi Chong Company and Kum Hong Wa's Noodle and Chop Suey Parlor. After 1910, there were almost no Chinese-run restaurants in the Dalles. And this might be because all of Chinatown knew that in 1909, Wong Sen had not been allowed back into the US when witnesses told immigration inspectors that they had seen him cooking at his restaurant when his regular cooks were not able to come. At that time, a restaurant cook was considered a laborer, and under the Chinese Exclusion Act, and under most circumstances, laborers were not permitted re-entry. Wong Sen had had to leave for China suddenly to attend to his sick wife, which is why he did not have time to obtain the paperwork that would enable his return. Since he was a partner in the Yi Chong Company, he believed that he could return to the US and bring along his 12-year-old son. When he and his son Jin Chui arrived in Seattle, they were denied admission and detained. His brother and business partner, Wong Kan, helped him appeal his case with the help of Fred Wilson and Henry St. Rayner, two attorneys in the Dalles. Wong Sen and Jen Chui remained in detention in Seattle for 3.5 months as the case was investigated. Finally, Wong Sen asked his brother to stop the appeal. He wrote, "It will be very hard for Jin Chui because he gets seasick. I am willing to return to China, so don't appeal my case. I am satisfied to go home. There are people here whose cases have been appealed and pending for more than a year. Maybe my case will hang that long. Jin Chui is too young to be penned up in this old jail that long."
So we'll switch a little bit now to the archaeology. So this is an outline of the building here. It's locally known as the Chinese building, but we now know it as the Wing Hong Hai Company store. And we're going to put a deck out the back of the building that lines up with the street level so that you don't fall out of this set of doors 14 feet down onto concrete. So as part of that, we were going to put in posts. And so we dug in, excavate an archaeological unit at each one of those post locations. And the photo on the right shows a couple of those units, test unit 1 and test unit 2 laid out. And then this is just a series of those Sanborn maps that show where the test units are in relationship to the building. So here's the building, here's the 4 back behind it. Here's another one that we excavated out in the parking lot to try and get an idea of what was going on outside of what turned out to be the cellar for the earlier building that had been burned down in 1879. And then a couple of other excavation units that were done by a company out of Portland, Archaeological Investigations Northwest, as part of a proposed hotel development. Here you can see by 1889, that area is under a platform or an addition to the building. 1892, pretty much the same. It says it's a platform there, so it's probably the platform that was used to dry laundry. And by 1900, that platform had probably been enclosed and turned into a wash house, and then the platform for drying had been shifted to the back. And by 1909, it was pretty much the same. 1926 is pretty much the same as well, except you can see that there's now no building over here behind where this unit had been excavated. That had at one time been both Chinese lodgings and Japanese lodgings. And by 1941, the last remaining store, here's the Chuki and Company store. This one was just vacant or used for storage, and here's the units just kind of hanging out after the wash house had been torn down. So it's always good to have friends and talented archaeological friends at that coming to help excavate. This is Melissa Darby, who got the permit to do the work there, and she came out from Portland to help. And Marge and Mike Dryden, who at that time were archaeologists with the scenic area, and Rick McClure, who's an archaeologist, retired now with the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. And as part of the excavations, we had public open houses. It's hard to keep people away when you're digging right off of the alley and people are curious. And besides that, we didn't want to keep people away. We wanted to kind of share what we were finding and what we were doing back there. So here we are, kind of hard at work and with a lot of people coming to visit and hear the story about what we were doing. So this is one of the archaeological units, kind of looking down on it. There's kind of a sandy layer here, which we found a little mystifying until we dug down a little bit deeper and found that to be on top of the stone wall. And this stone wall is an extension of the foundation of the current building, and it matches the footprint of the building that was there before 1879, the one that burned down. So it became kind of an open cellar hole after the new building was rebuilt. And a perfect place to throw garbage for the next several decades. So it turned out to be a pretty great archaeological site as well. Here's another one of the units. This is one next to that doorway that got enlarged by the creamery when they modified the building and put down the cement slab. So you can see the bricks that they knocked out of that doorway to make that doorway bigger and then use them as fill. You can also see some things that they probably cleaned out of the building as well. This is an opium pipe bowl there and a wine bottle there. And then this is just a series of pictures as we dig through this unit. So we did the excavated stratigraphically. So we tried to remove that fill first so that it wasn't mixing up with all of our other layers down below so that we could keep track of time period as well. So here's with that fill removed, you can see the wine bottle's still there, and now some pieces of china coming up and parts of opium cans. We've stripped off that occupation or depositional surface now, and you see it's a pretty clean layer here. This is what we think are silt deposits from the 1894 flood. And here's a wine bottle that floated in with that flood. And you can see that in profile. Here's the midden deposits that are really thick with artifacts and bone and stuff associated with, a large group of people eating and living and cooking in that building and throwing the debris out back. And here's the 1894 flood silt. So you can see that that's pretty clean. And there's the impression of the base of that wine bottle. So you remove those flood silts and you get another occupation or depositional layer. So much more in the way of, there's an opium pipe bowl there and more European or an American ceramics there and some Chinese stoneware there and lots of pieces of tin and copper. And then this is getting near the final layer. So this is the burned lens from that 1879 fire. And then material that was deposited right on top of it. So the shoes and watch parts and jewelry bits that are all from that first occupant after the fire, the shoe store and the watch repair place. And then this is the unit that we dug out in the parking lot to try and get a better idea of what was going on outside of the cellar area. And you can see that we had a lot of fill. So this is all related to the demolition of the Chuki company store and the doxing store and kind of the grading of the parking lot in preparation of the parking lot for the asphalt that was placed on top. And here are the intact deposits, and part of those intact deposits contained an articulated rabbit skeleton, which was kind of interesting. So, we started these excavations and we're kind of overwhelmed by the amount of stuff that we were finding. You can see this is a screen from like one bucket full of material, and there's a lot of ceramic fragments, lots of bone fragments, buttons and pins and things like that. So it was really an astronomical amount of artifacts, and it turned out to be quite overwhelming. You can see this is what one of those levels looked like when we just kind of picked the artifacts out of it. This is what it looked like all cleaned up. And we were really fortunate in that some graduate students from Oregon State University volunteered to really take on the management of this collection. So we gave them bags of dirty artifacts, and they spent months or years kind of cleaning them, organizing them, labeling them, putting them all in order, and trying to really figure out what we had found. That was just a tremendous amount of help. So we took a lot of notes also, and notes and photographs. So this is showing the sidewall of that last unit that we excavated with the silt layer here and the wine bottle impression, the different layers that we could see in the walls. And here's one of the artifacts mapped on the floor. And it turned out to be a drugstore, a bottle from the drugstore that at that point was located just across the street. And this is what that drugstore looked like inside after it had moved over to 2nd Street, but it gives you kind of an idea what these stores look like. So one of the tasks now that the artifacts have all been cleaned up and organized and stuff is to try and tie them back into the stories. So these are some quotes from some of the immigration records, and you can see how the artifacts really kind of reflect the business that was going on there. So you have the buttons and the pins and stuff related to the laundry and clothes mending and washing. You have bottles and stoneware vessels and stuff. These are directly related to Chinese goods, and these are your American goods that were, consumed here by the residents of the store. You can see really an idea of some of the amount of bone that we have here. Currently, the bone's down at Southern Oregon University, and a graduate student there is going to do some analysis of that. So we'll kind of get a really good record of what people were eating on a day-to-day basis there. There's a lot of fish bone, pig, cow, duck, chicken. So it'll be great to have some numbers. Another opium pipe bowl and a part of a tiger whiskey jug and a rice bowl there. And this really relates to the use of the 10 men that were living in the store and the laundry and cooking and using the kitchen. Other items are related to the gambling that took place in the building. So here we have the quotes from the Chinese inspector in 1911. We have some items that can be used in gambling. So the buttons being used as buttons, but they can also be used as gaming pieces. And these are gaming pieces here in Chinese coins. And we found quite a good amount of Chinese coins back there, some of them not in very good shape. And then a lot of gaming pieces as well, which is really reflective of the use of the store, both probably for recreational and maybe also for commercial gambling. As part of this excavation, we were kind of contacted by the Discovery Center. They wanted us to do an exhibit on what we've been finding out about the Chinatown and some of the artifacts that we found, and also some of the artifacts that local folks like Marilyn Ernest in town had been collecting for decades. So we kind of drew all of this together and did an exhibit, which was pretty well received, and it was a lot of work, but it was a good thing to do. And then we continued to do interpretation at the building with open houses, and we also have some interpretive signs that are kind of mounted to the front of the building as well. And of course, no project like this goes without a lot of help by a lot of people. And I'm sure we've left somebody off this list, but this kind of gives you an idea of a lot of the people that have really lent a hand and stepped forward to help with this project. And that's about it.
Thank you so much for that wonderful deep dive into the Dalles.
Yeah.
We'd love to do a little bit of a Q&A at this point, and we have some Q&As in the chat as well as in the Q&A function. So I think that myself and Sarah will just start to moderate those. Sarah, did you have any questions that stood out to you at first glance?
In the chat, one of the earlier questions was from Sue-Ann relating to where the Chinese workers lived in the businesses. Did some of them live upstairs of the businesses?
I think there was probably living quarters behind the businesses, and then some of these buildings had lower stories, and those might have been used that way too, but it's not, none of the documents really talk about where everyone was living, so it's hard to know. And I'm sure, you know, as people came and went and needed housing, those numbers and how many people were there probably shifted as well.
So from Hal, we have a question, Hal Joe. Do any of the archival documents of those stores, whether they be business records or family documents, did any of those documents survive to this day?
We haven't been able to find any of those documents. We're kind of hoping that working with the Chinese diaspora project that we'll be able to make some connections with the families back in China and maybe try and see whether, you know, any correspondence or anything like that survive. But we really haven't had much luck to date. We have tracked down and had a few contacts, really limited contacts with the descendants of Wang Ling, the proprietor of the Chuki and Company store. But they've kind of indicated that they didn't really have much in the way of records.
And we also, you know, I know like Lee Jack had moved to Portland and then at one point went back to China, but I don't know whether, you know, whether there still are connections with, you know, Portland families as well that might still remain in the area, and same with the Sits.
I think that was one of my thoughts too, was you had indicated that Wing Jack had moved to Portland and married, and so the question would be, are there any descendants from them still in the Portland area?
Yeah, I don't know, and I'm hoping that, you know, presentations like this might, you know, inspire people either to do research or come forward and say, we know, you know, we have a connection with the Dalles.
Yes, yes. So Trish says it was a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. A question from Suan is, was the Chuki store have a connection to one in California?
Not that we know of. And I don't, and I don't know this, and maybe someone else might, but perhaps the store name has a meaning that is more common. Right. And it's a name chosen for a store for another reason. But a lot of people would call the proprietors of the store the same name as the store. So
right,
that's why
auspicious name.
More than one Doc Sing, and sometimes there's more than one Chuki, because they just, you know, there's records that say, oh, I know there are two brothers, but I call them both Chuki.
From John Ratliff, a question: what led to the Chinese residents leaving the Dalles?
Well, I think it just, you know, a lot of them were aging by that time. There wasn't a lot of new residents moving in, so the older folks just kind of either passed away or moved into the larger communities like Portland, or moved back to China like Lee Jack did.
And I think there was also probably job related as well, because certain, you know, of the big jobs like the railroad, and then later on with cannery work as well, that brought Chinese to the Dalles for work also might have changed.
Right, the cannery shut down, the railroads no longer needed Chinese constructing them or maintaining them, so some of those jobs went away.
From Wenda Tai, a question: do we have information about the actual Chinese names, and I think she's referring to Chinese characters, that are not Romanized, of these people? This is about developing a narrative from a more authentic lens. I have found that interpretations at Cheung to be still from a Western point of view and not from the Chinese immigrants' point of view.
Yeah, we do. We can, from some of those immigration records, associate characters with the names of people, the names of businesses, and how folks were referring to the Dalles as well. So we're trying to incorporate some of those characters into our interpretations now.
So in the Q&A from Janice, was the amount of travel by these Chinese residents between US and China average or unique?
Well, that's interesting because, you know, we get so our research is really biased by the Exclusion Act, and the Exclusion Act records are almost all related to travel. So if you were traveling, you had to kind of fill out this paperwork when you arrived or get pre-approved before you left. So there's a little bit of bias there. And I think, so what we're really doing is we're doing the records of the traveling class more like. And so I'm sure these people were traveling more than the typical average Chinese immigrant. But it's kind of the bias of the records, I think.
But I think also looking at those travel, how much travel they did, it's very interesting to see how they really were, because there were restrictions about them bringing their families, what kinds of strategies they used to maintain their ties with their families, and which required some traveling back and forth. And I think sometimes they also were traveling to do business as well. So.
Yeah, it is really striking how much travel there is back and forth, and how often it is. And that's one of the reasons that they entered into the partnerships, is because they could, that way multiple members of the family or the community could share in that merchant status, and one person could kind of manage the store while the others were traveling or engaging in other kind of ways to make a living beyond just the store. So the stores really kind of became an integral part of the community in that way as well.
And then just reading those documents, we've also learned that a lot of times people did other types of work to make money, but if they were planning a trip or wanting to bring back family, they had to maintain their merchant status for at least a year. So they would set aside that time or also invest in a partnership to get that status for that time period, and then they could bring over their family. So it was interesting to see the different strategies that help them, you know, make a life here in the US if that was what they wanted to do.
From Raymond Sid, we have a question about how many Chinese residents remain in the Dalles today.
Boy, that's a good question. So we have, there's kind of a few descendants of some folks that moved here, not into the Dalles, but onto a farm in the 1920s, I think, something like that. And so that family is still here in the Dalles, but not really many of the other original pioneer families have any descendants here. There's kind of a newer Chinese community as well.
I'm a recent Dalles resident, even though I've lived here for 30 years. I'm still a newcomer, kind of.
There's a question from Kathy regarding the building that you're working on now, and who the ownership is. Is it you that own it? And what are the plans with that building? Future plans.
Well, so when I bought the building in 2000, I had a 5-year plan to get it all restored and to rent out the street level as a commercial building and then keep the basement level as kind of my shop and storage. And as you can see, I kind of strayed from that 5-year plan now that it's a 20-year plan. I think the idea is to kind of maybe find a sympathetic tenant for the building and rent it out. That's kind of the idea now. But it still has a long ways to go. There's really not much in the way of plumbing or electricity or heat or anything yet. We finished doing a seismic upgrade, so that's done. We're mostly finished the facade restoration, so that's done. So now it's time to work on some of those interior details and clean out some of the junk I've accumulated over the years and really get to work at that.
From Raymond, have you found any interactions between the Dalles Chinatown and the Seufert Cannery and Fishery?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of interaction. I think the Seuferts contracted their labor for the cannery with the Sitt family.
But I think that was some of it was out of I think a Portland connection,
But then the Sitt family was also here in the Dalles. And at one point, the bunkhouse where the Chinese were staying at the cannery burned down. And so they moved, the Chinese that were in the bunkhouse moved to the Dalles and stayed there in the Chinatown as well. So I think there was some interaction, definitely.
So my question is, this Sitt family in the Dalles, is that a connection to the Sitt family here in Portland, the Sitt-Back family?
I don't know the exact relationships, and I have not necessarily looked into that. But I mean, when Sid Jack was coming back with his son, a lot of the Portland family there kind of testified and told immigration inspectors about what his family life in the village was like. So if they're from the same village and area, they're maybe connected.
From Sue-Ann again, she says, when they sent money back to the families in China, do they mail US bills in cash or in bank checks, and the banks in China will then convert US dollars into Chinese money?
That's a good question. I don't know.
I have no idea how those money transfers went. There's a little bit about that in the kind of probate records for Li Yun Hong, and I think the Chinese consulate was at that point kind of trying to get the remains of his estate to his family in China. So there might have been at least sometimes a connection through the consulate, but there's probably were also businesses that did that as part of their function, transferring funds from the Dalles to Hong Kong, then to China, or things like that. But I'm not really sure of how that all worked.
Yeah, and at some point, when Li Yun Hong's older brother Li Yun But was in China, Li Yun Hong reported that that he would send money to Li Yun But in small amounts, while Li Yun But was in China. So, and I don't know how that was done.
Okay, does anybody else have further questions? This has just been a fascinating presentation. I certainly have enjoyed it.
And also, several of those businesses mentioned that they did some kind of banking, which I thought was kind of interesting too.
One question from a logistics standpoint, will you be hosting another open house at some point?
Yeah, I think so. We generally tried to have open houses at Cherry Festival, so which is kind of the yearly festival here in the Dalles. They generally have kind of a carnival running down on First Street, so it's a good time to have an open house and attract folks that aren't usually interested in going and touring old buildings. So we plan to do that the next time there is a Cherry Festival. And also we have a Facebook page where you could probably contact us and we could, open things up. Where I'm down there working on things on a fairly regular basis. So if people just drop by, it works.
From Sue Cheung, she makes a comment that there are several recent studies on remittances to China and the methods of sending money.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see.
And from Debbie Cheung, she suggests that Wells Fargo Bank would probably know about money transfers and perhaps checking with their Wells Fargo Chinese museum. I believe that's down in California.
Yeah, and also there were like the freight companies and those kinds of businesses. And I think the Wells Fargo or their Wells Fargo office in the Dalles also were all like on First Street, within that same area. So
Yeah, I think prior to that 1879 fire, the Wells Fargo office was just right next door. So.
Jackie and Eric, back to your Facebook page. If you do get a minute, if you could post that into the chat, that would be very helpful for our guests who might want to be following you.
I think it's just called the Dalles Chinatown on Facebook.
All right. A couple more questions in the chat. Did you come across any ledgers with names of residents and visitors to the Dalles back in the days?
Not really. Some of the local museums have ledgers from businesses, and some of them talk about the goods they've shipped for the Chinese or shipped to the Chinese. So we've been trying to look at some of those sources.
I think the French family that also had the bank also did freighting, and I think early on they did there's records of them sending stuff like to like the Cheung.
Thank you, Maris, for posting the link to the Facebook page in the chat.
Thanks, Maris.
I would also welcome you both to let us know when the Cherry Festival happens, and we can send out maybe a notice to our listserv as well. With that, if you all have any closing remarks, any other questions before we wrap up? Oh, and Marilyn Ernest in the Q&A, she has written the book Chinatown, the Dalles, Oregon, for folks who may want to look at that. With that, if you all enjoyed today's program, please stay tuned for the 8th program in the Hidden Histories series. This will take a look at early Chinese history in Astoria with Lisa Penner, Sue-Ann Ho, and Dr. Chelsea Vaughn. Sue-Ann Ho, as we know, is part of this chat today and has been very vocal in the chats with questions, and excited to talk to her next time. This presentation will be on October 30th. So be sure to check out our website at www.portlandchinatown.org in the next few weeks for more information and to register. We will love to see you all there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.